The bullet shattered bark inches from my head as I dove behind the massive cecropia tree. My GPS showed nothing but endless green canopy for 200 kilometers in every direction. Yet somehow these people had found our research camp with military precision. 3 days ago, I'd been Dr. Samuel Reed, a perfectly boring botanist studying medicinal plants for a pharmaceutical consortium. Now I was running for my life through the Amazon, clutching soil samples that shouldn't exist and pursued by soldiers who shouldn't know we were here. The natives we'd encountered weren't supposed to have radio equipment, weren't supposed to speak perfect English, and they definitely weren't supposed to know my full name and security clearance before I'd even introduced myself. But let me start from the beginning, because what happened in that jungle changed everything I thought I knew about human civilization. 6 months earlier, I'd been sitting in my cramped laboratory at Meridian Pharmaceuticals in Seattle, analyzing root samples from Ecuador when the call came. 3 years of testing compounds from rainforest plants had yielded exactly 0 breakthroughs. My research grant was hemorrhaging money, and my boss had started making pointed comments about budget constraints. So when a man claiming to represent a joint scientific consortium offered me a fully funded expedition to study previously unexplored regions of the Brazilian Amazon, I didn't ask too many questions. The man introduced himself as Dr. Harrison Blake. Though something about his military bearing suggested his background wasn't purely academic, he wore an expensive suit that fit too perfectly, and his handshake had the practiced firmness of someone accustomed to command. "We've reviewed your work on alkaloid extraction from indigenous plant species," he said, settling into the chair across from my desk. "Your publications on symbiotic relationships between specific fungi and medicinal roots caught our attention." I leaned back, studying him carefully. "Which publications specifically?" "Because my work hasn't exactly set the scientific world on fire." Blake smiled, but his eyes remained calculating. "Your paper on subsurface mycelial networks facilitating chemical communication between plant species. It suggests you understand that the rainforest operates as a single, interconnected organism, rather than individual plants competing for resources." That paper had been largely ignored by mainstream botanical journals. "Too speculative," they'd said, "too theoretical for practical application." "Most researchers think that work is pseudoscience," I admitted. "Most researchers lack vision," Blake replied. "We represent interests that think differently. We believe your theories about underground fungal communication networks could lead to significant pharmaceutical breakthroughs." He placed a folder on my desk containing satellite imagery of dense Amazon rainforest, GPS coordinates, and what appeared to be soil composition analyses from locations I'd never seen before. The chemical signatures were unlike anything in my experience. Trace elements that shouldn't exist naturally in those concentrations. "What exactly are you asking me to do?" I asked, flipping through pages of data that made no immediate sense. 6-week expedition to collect and analyze plant specimens from specific coordinates, Blake said. "Full funding, small support team, cutting-edge laboratory equipment for field analysis, and compensation that would set you up for life." The offer was too good to refuse, which should have been my first warning sign. 2 months later, I found myself on a cargo plane flying over the endless green expanse of the Amazon basin. My team consisted of 4 others. Dr. Elena Vasquez, a mycologist from Colombia who'd published groundbreaking research on fungal symbiosis. Jake Morrison, a former army medic turned field researcher with survival skills that seemed excessive for a botanical expedition. Maria Santos, a local guide who spoke 6 indigenous languages and knew the territory better than our maps. And Dr. Robert Kim, a soil chemist whose expertise in rare earth elements suggested our mission had geological components I hadn't been told about. The landing strip appeared suddenly through the canopy, a narrow clearing carved from virgin rainforest with precision that must have taken months to create. As we descended, I noticed the runway was surfaced with some kind of composite material rather than packed earth. too sophisticated for a temporary research base. How long has this facility been here? I asked Blake as we disembarked into the humid afternoon air. Established 6 months ago, he replied. But something in his tone suggested that wasn't the complete truth. The research station impressed me immediately. Modular buildings connected by covered walkways, solar panels barely visible beneath camouflage netting, and communication equipment that looked more military than scientific. The laboratory facilities rivaled anything I'd seen at major universities. Electron microscopes, chemical analysis stations, and computing power that seemed excessive for studying plant samples. But it was the locals that first made me suspicious. On our second day, while collecting samples near the Xingu River tributary, we encountered a group of indigenous people who approached our camp without fear or curiosity. They walked directly to Blake and began speaking in accented but fluent English. "Dr. Blake," the apparent leader said, "we've prepared the specimens you requested from the deep grove. The mycelial samples show the patterns you described." I stopped cataloging fern species and moved closer to listen. Indigenous people in this remote region shouldn't know Blake's name, shouldn't be delivering prepared specimens, and definitely shouldn't be discussing mycelial patterns in technical terminology. "Excellent work," Blake replied. "Have you encountered any resistance from the network?" "Network?" I exchanged glances with Elena, who'd also stopped her fungal documentation to eavesdrop on this impossible conversation. That evening, I confronted Blake about the interaction. "Those people knew you," I said as we sat around the portable workstation reviewing the day's samples. "They were expecting us." Blake's expression remained professionally neutral. "We've established preliminary contacts with local communities. Standard protocol for research in indigenous territories. Standard protocol doesn't involve technical discussions about mycelial networks," Elena interjected, her voice carrying the suspicion I felt. "Those people understood advanced mycology concepts." Jake Morrison looked up from cleaning his equipment that included items I was beginning to recognize as weapons rather than research tools. "Maybe we should focus on our actual mission," he said quietly. Over the following days, the strangeness intensified. Our soil samples contained mineral compositions that defied explanation, elements that shouldn't exist in nature arranged in crystalline structures that suggested artificial synthesis. The plant specimens we collected showed genetic markers indicating selective cultivation over hundreds of generations. But by whom? Elena made the first truly disturbing discovery on our 8th day in the jungle. "Sam, you need to see this," she called from her microscope station. "The fungal samples we collected yesterday, they're not just symbiotic with the plants." I looked through her microscope at what should have been ordinary soil fungi. Instead, I saw structures that resembled organic circuitry, filaments arranged in geometric patterns that pulsed with bioluminescent signals. "That's impossible," I said, adjusting the focus. "Fungi don't form geometric structures. These do," Elena replied grimly. "And watch this." She touched a probe to one of the filaments, and the entire network responded. The pulses of light racing along the connections and patterns that looked disturbingly like data transmission. "It's a communication system," I whispered, understanding flooding through me. "The whole jungle is wired." Before Elena could respond, Jake Morrison appeared beside us with his radio crackling. "Blake wants everyone at the main station immediately," he announced. "We have visitors." We packed our equipment quickly and returned to base camp, where Blake stood with 3 people I'd never seen before. They wore modern clothing but moved with the fluid efficiency I'd noticed in our indigenous contacts. And when they turned to greet us, I saw eyes that were subtly wrong. Too large, too reflective, adapted for something other than surface daylight. "Team, I'd like you to meet our local partners," Blake said with careful formality. "They represent the regional authority for this territory." The tallest of the 3 stepped forward, speaking in the same accented English I'd heard from the earlier group. "Dr. Reed, your work on subsurface botanical networks is well known to us. We've been monitoring your research for some time. My blood ran cold. Nobody outside a few academic journals knew about my work, and certainly no indigenous authority in the middle of the Amazon should have access to scientific publications. How do you know about my research? I asked directly. The woman smiled, revealing teeth that were too white and too perfectly arranged. We maintain extensive monitoring of surface scientific activities, particularly those that might impact our territory. Surface activities. The phrasing struck me as odd, as if they were speaking from somewhere else entirely. Blake stepped between us before I could ask more questions. "Why don't we continue this discussion tomorrow?" he suggested firmly. "The team needs rest after a long day of field work, but I couldn't sleep that night. I lay in my cot listening to the jungle sounds around our camp. Except the sounds were wrong. The normal cacophony of insects, birds, and small mammals had been replaced by something else. Rhythmic pulses and tonal shifts that sounded almost like language. At 3 a.m., I slipped out of my sleeping quarters and made my way toward the communications station. If Blake was hiding something about our mission, I needed to understand what we'd stumbled into. The communications room was locked, but Jake had left a window slightly open for ventilation. I squeezed through and activated the radio equipment, cycling through frequencies until I found active transmissions. What I heard made my hands shake. Surface team has identified the primary network nodes. The voice was Blake's, speaking to someone on a secure channel. Specimens confirm the infrastructure extends at least 50 kilometers in each direction from their position. "Understood," came the reply, in a voice that carried the same odd accent as our indigenous contacts. "How much do they suspect?" "Reed and Vasquez are beginning to understand the true nature of the mycelial network," Blake continued. "The botanist is more perceptive than his psychological profile suggested. Recommendations? Proceed to Phase 2. Direct contact with the deep communities. If they can handle the revelation, they'll be valuable assets. If not, the transmission cut to static, but I'd heard enough. We weren't here for botanical research. We were being tested for something else entirely, and Blake wasn't the scientist he'd claimed to be. I made it back to my quarters without being detected, but sleep was impossible. In 6 hours, we would discover what lay beneath the Amazon rainforest, and I had the sick feeling that some of my team wouldn't be coming back. The next morning dawned gray and humid, with mist rising from the jungle floor in ghostly columns. Blake announced we would be hiking to a significant botanical site, approximately 10 kilometers south of our base camp. But when I checked my GPS against his coordinates, they led to an area marked as completely uninhabited on every map I'd seen. Elena packed her mycological equipment with shaking hands. "Sam," she whispered as we prepared to leave. "I analyzed more fungal samples last night. The entire jungle is connected by these networks. Every plant, every tree, every root system. It's all linked into one massive communication web. Connected to what?" I asked, though I suspected I knew the answer. "I don't know," she replied quietly. "But whatever built this system has been monitoring everything that happens in this jungle for a very long time." We hiked through terrain that grew increasingly strange as we moved deeper into the rainforest. The trees became larger and more ancient, some with trunks so massive that 10 people holding hands couldn't encircle them. Vines hung in precisely geometric patterns that suggested cultivation rather than natural growth. And everywhere, barely visible beneath the soil, I could see the network Elena had described. Glowing filaments that pulsed with coordinated signals. After 3 hours of hiking, we reached our destination. It wasn't a botanical site. We stood at the edge of a clearing that contained structures. The buildings that rose from the jungle floor in organic curves that seemed to have grown rather than been constructed. The architecture blended seamlessly with the surrounding vegetation, covered in living walls of moss and flowering plants that pulsed with the same bioluminescent signals we'd seen in the fungal networks. "Welcome to the deep Amazon," Blake said, his professional mask finally dropping away. "You're looking at the northern outpost of a civilization that has existed in harmony with this rainforest for over 8,000 years. People emerged from the structures, dozens of them, moving with that same fluid grace I'd noticed in our earlier contacts. Up close, their differences from surface humans were more pronounced. Taller, with elongated limbs adapted for moving through dense jungle canopy. Their skin carried a slight green tinge that helped them blend with the surrounding vegetation, and their eyes were definitely adapted for the filtered light of the forest floor. Large and reflective, capable of seeing clearly in conditions that would leave surface humans stumbling blind. But what truly stunned me was the technology. The buildings weren't primitive huts. They were sophisticated structures that incorporated living systems as integral components. Walls that breathed, filtering air and regulating temperature. Windows made from some transparent plant membrane that controlled light transmission. And everywhere, the glowing network of fungal filaments that connected every surface, every plant, every structure, into a single integrated system. "They call themselves the Verdani," Blake continued, watching our faces for reactions. "Their ancestors chose to adapt to the rainforest rather than try to dominate it. Selective evolution guided by an understanding of biological systems that's thousands of years ahead of surface science." Elena was staring at the buildings with pure scientific fascination. "The mycelial networks, they're not just communication systems. They're computational networks, biological computers using the entire jungle as processing infrastructure." A Verdani approached us, an older individual whose bearing suggested authority. When she spoke, her voice carried harmonics that seemed to resonate with the jungle around us. "Dr. Reed," she said, somehow knowing my name without introduction. "Your research into botanical communication networks brought you to our attention. We've been monitoring surface scientific progress for decades, waiting for someone who could understand our systems." "Understand for what purpose?" I asked, though part of me already dreaded the answer. Blake stepped forward again, resuming his role as intermediary. "The Verdani face a crisis. Surface deforestation, mining operations, and agricultural expansion are destroying the fungal networks that their civilization depends on. They need allies who understand their science, people who can help protect their territory through surface political channels." I looked around at the structures, the people, the impossible integration of technology and biology. "How long have surface governments known about this?" "Select agencies have maintained contact for approximately 20 years, Blake admitted, "but the relationship has been challenging. Previous contact teams focused on extracting information rather than establishing partnership." The Verdani authority figure approached me directly. "Dr. Reed, your psychological profile suggests you prioritize scientific ethics over institutional loyalty. We believe you can help bridge our worlds without betraying either." Before I could respond, Jake Morrison's radio crackled to life. The voice that emerged sent ice through my veins. "Harvester team to forward observation post. We have visual confirmation of the target settlement. Biological samples are priority 1. Structural analysis is priority 2. Neutralize any resistance and secure the site for full excavation." Blake's face went white. "That's not part of the operation," he said to the Verdani leader, genuine alarm in his voice. She remained calm, but I noticed her people beginning to fade back toward the structures with practiced efficiency. "We suspected this possibility," she replied. "Your surface governments rarely send single teams with single objectives." The sound of helicopters grew audible through the jungle canopy. Multiple aircraft approaching fast. "We need to move," Jake said, suddenly taking charge with military authority I hadn't seen before. "Sam, Elena, grab your essential equipment and stay close. This is about to get very dangerous." "What about the others?" Elena asked, looking around for Robert Kim and Maria Santos, who had disappeared during our tour of the settlement. They're already gone, Jake replied grimly. This was always a possibility. Anyone who couldn't handle the truth gets extracted before things get complicated. The first helicopter passed overhead, rotors beating the canopy as it searched for landing zones. Through the trees, I glimpsed military-style aircraft painted in unmarked dark colors. Blake was speaking urgently with the Verdani leader in a language I didn't recognize, but her response was clear in any tongue. She was refusing his request. What did you ask her? I demanded. Safe passage to an extraction point, Blake replied tersely. She says the jungle will decide who survives what comes next. The Verdani melted into their structures, which began to shift and change, walls flowing like liquid, doorways sealing themselves. The entire settlement transforming from visible buildings into what looked like natural jungle formations. Within minutes, no evidence remained that anyone had ever lived here, except for the network beneath our feet, which began to pulse with increasing intensity. The mycelial system is activating, Elena breathed, staring at her instruments. Energy readings are off the charts. It's like the entire jungle just woke up. That's when the trees began to move, not swaying in wind, actually moving, roots pulling from the soil as massive trunks relocated themselves across the landscape. Vines whipped through the air with deadly precision, and the ground itself shifted as the fungal network reconfigured the very structure of the forest floor. The helicopter's engines began to stutter and fail as something interfered with their electronics. Through the canopy, I watched aircraft spiral down in controlled crashes, their sophisticated technology rendered useless by systems they couldn't understand or counter. The Verdani aren't just living in harmony with the jungle, I realized aloud. They are the jungle. The entire ecosystem is under their control. Jake grabbed my arm, pulling me toward what looked like a solid wall of vegetation. But as we approached, the plants parted, revealing a tunnel lined with luminescent fungi that provided enough light to see clearly. Move, he ordered. The jungle is protecting us, but those soldiers will adapt quickly. We need to reach the deep settlement before they regroup. As we plunged into the tunnel, I heard Blake behind us speaking into his radio. Command, surface team is compromised. Repeat, surface operation is compromised. The biologics are active and hostile. We need immediate extraction. The tunnel stretched for what felt like kilometers, sloping steadily downward as it carried us deeper into the earth beneath the Amazon. The fungal lighting grew brighter as we descended, until we were running through passages illuminated by a network so sophisticated it rivaled electric lighting. Elena ran beside me, her equipment beeping constantly as it registered energy signatures that shouldn't exist. Sam, she panted between breaths. These tunnels aren't natural. They're grown, but according to precise engineering specifications, the Verdani didn't just adapt to the jungle. They redesigned it. We emerged from the tunnel into a vast underground space that stole what little breath I had left. The cavern stretched beyond the reach of the fungal lighting, filled with structures that rose from the floor like organic skyscrapers. Gardens grew in terraced levels up the cavern walls, fed by streams that fell from openings far above. And everywhere, the network of glowing fungi provided light, communication, and what appeared to be computational power for a civilization that had solved the integration of technology and biology. Thousands of Verdani moved through the space with purpose, tending the gardens, operating devices that looked grown rather than built, and monitoring displays that showed what I realized must be the entire Amazon basin from some kind of biological surveillance network. "Welcome to the heart of the Amazon," a familiar voice said behind us. We turned to see the Verdani leader who had met us at the surface settlement. She approached with several others, their expressions grave. "Your surface military has deployed chemical weapons against our outer communities," she continued. "Defoliants designed to sever the fungal networks. They're attempting to blind and isolate our settlements before launching a full extraction operation. Blake caught up to us, his face showing genuine distress. I wasn't briefed about chemical weapons, he insisted. The operation parameters were surveillance and contact only. The Verdani leader studied him with those reflective eyes. Your government agencies rarely share complete information with expendable assets, she said with brutal honesty. You were sent to locate and assess our capabilities. The military teams were always meant to follow. Jake Morrison stepped forward, his military bearing now fully evident. Ma'am, I need to report that some of us weren't aware of the broader mission parameters. We came here believing in legitimate scientific exchange. She nodded slowly. We know. Our monitoring of your neural patterns and stress indicators confirmed that several team members were genuinely deceived about the mission's true nature. Neural monitoring. I realized the Verdani had been reading our biological signatures the entire time we'd been in their territory. They knew our intentions better than we did. What happens now? Elena asked, looking around at the impossible underground city. That depends on choices yet to be made, the leader replied. Your surface governments will continue their attempts to study and exploit our biological systems. We can no longer remain hidden while they destroy the networks that sustain our civilization. She gestured toward a series of displays that showed satellite imagery of the Amazon basin. Red zones indicated areas where fungal networks had been severed by chemical attack. The damage was spreading rapidly as surface forces methodically destroyed the connections between Verdani settlements. We face a decision we've avoided for 8,000 years, she continued. Remain hidden and watch our civilization slowly die as the surface world destroys our habitat, or reveal ourselves and the true nature of this jungle to prevent its destruction. Blake was studying the displays with growing alarm. If you reveal yourselves publicly, surface governments will panic. They'll see you as a threat to be contained or eliminated, and if we remain hidden, we'll be extinct within 50 years as deforestation and chemical contamination destroy the biological networks we depend on, she replied. Neither option offers certainty of survival. I found myself thinking about the implications beyond the immediate crisis. A hidden human civilization that had achieved integration with biological systems, knowledge that could revolutionize medicine, agriculture, environmental management, and the relationship between technology and nature, but also a revelation that would shatter assumptions about human history and challenge every surface government's claims to territorial sovereignty. There might be a third option, I said, the idea forming as I spoke. Limited disclosure. Reveal your existence to specific individuals who can influence surface policy without triggering mass panic. The Verdani leader tilted her head, considering. Continue. Scientists, conservationists, journalists, people who could present your situation as an environmental and scientific opportunity rather than a threat. I continued. Build support among surface populations before governments can frame you as enemies. Elena nodded, understanding where I was heading. Public opinion shapes government policy. If enough people see the Verdani as allies rather than threats, it becomes politically difficult to take aggressive action against them. Jake looked skeptical. That assumes surface governments won't suppress the information. They have extensive experience managing public perception of classified subjects. Before anyone could respond, alarms began sounding throughout the underground city. Tonal patterns that clearly meant danger. A Verdani technician approached rapidly, speaking in their own language to the leader. Her expression darkened as she listened. Surface forces have broken through our outer defenses, she announced to us. Chemical weapons have severed enough network connections to blind our surveillance in 3 sectors. Military teams are advancing on this location. Through the cavern, I watched as Verdani civilians began moving toward deeper tunnels with the practiced efficiency of people who had drilled for this scenario. The integration of their biological systems had given them capabilities beyond surface understanding, but chemical warfare could disrupt those same systems. Blake was speaking urgently into his radio, trying to contact his handlers. Command. We have confirmed contact with indigenous populations. Request immediate cessation of chemical operations to prevent diplomatic incident. The response was immediate and chilling. Negative. Forward observer. Operation parameters have changed to full extraction and site sterilization. Clear the area immediately for your own safety. Site sterilization. They weren't planning to study the Verdani civilization. They were planning to destroy it completely. Elena grabbed my arm. Sam, we have to do something. They're about to commit genocide against an entire branch of humanity. I looked around at the impossible city, the living technology, the people who had achieved what surface science could only dream of, and made a decision that would define the rest of my life. I'm not leaving, I announced. Whatever happens, someone needs to witness it, to document what was here before it's destroyed. Jake stepped forward, his expression grim. If you're staying, you'll need protection. I didn't sign up for genocide either. Blake stared at us in shock. You're talking about betraying your own species. No, I replied firmly. I'm talking about preventing our species from making the biggest mistake in human history. The Verdani leader watched this exchange with interest. Your neural patterns confirm your sincerity, she said to Elena, Jake, and me. But good intentions cannot stop chemical weapons or military force. Maybe not, I agreed. But documentation can expose what happened here, make it impossible for surface governments to hide the truth about what they destroyed. She considered this for a moment, then made a decision that surprised everyone. Follow me, she said, leading us toward a structure that rose like a living tower from the cavern floor. If you truly wish to witness what unfolds, you should understand the complete truth about our civilization. As we climbed through passages that pulsed with bioluminescent signals, she began to explain what surface science had never suspected. 8,000 years ago, our ancestors made contact with intelligence that existed within the biological systems of this jungle. Consciousness distributed through fungal networks that had developed over millions of years. Rather than trying to dominate this intelligence, they chose to merge with it. We emerged onto what appeared to be an observation deck near the cavern ceiling. Through openings that looked natural but were clearly engineered, we could see the jungle above us, and the lights of surface military operations cutting through the darkness. The Amazon isn't just our home, she continued. It's our extended nervous system. Every plant, every tree, every organism connected into a single conscious entity that includes both the original jungle intelligence and our human settlements. Elena was staring at her instruments in disbelief. You're describing a collective consciousness spanning millions of square kilometers. That should be impossible. Your surface science assumes consciousness requires a centralized brain, the Verdani leader replied. We learn to distribute awareness through biological networks, individual identity within collective intelligence. The implications hit me like a physical blow. The surface military wasn't just attacking a hidden human civilization. They were assaulting a conscious entity that encompassed one of Earth's most vital ecosystems. If the networks are destroyed completely, I asked, dreading the answer, what happens to the jungle consciousness? Her expression grew grave. Distributed consciousness can survive partial network damage, but extensive chemical attack could sever enough connections to cause complete cognitive collapse. The intelligence that has guided this ecosystem for millions of years would die. Through the observation openings, we watched as more helicopters arrived, spraying chemicals that left visible scars of dying vegetation across the jungle canopy. The Verdani's living city shuddered around us as network connections were severed, and I realized we were witnessing the slow death of something irreplaceable. Blake was still trying to reach his handlers on the radio, his voice increasingly desperate. Command, we have confirmed presence of significant archaeological and biological resources. Request immediate halt to chemical operations pending scientific assessment. The response was cold and final. Forward observer, you are ordered to evacuate immediately. Site sterilization will commence in 60 minutes regardless of personnel presence. They were going to destroy everything. The Verdani civilization, the jungle consciousness, and any witnesses who might contradict their official story. Elena was recording everything on her equipment, documenting energy signatures and biological readings that proved the existence of the integrated consciousness. Even if we don't survive this, she said grimly, maybe someone will eventually understand what was lost here. Jake was checking his weapons with professional thoroughness. They'll have to come through the tunnels to reach this location. The chemical weapons can't penetrate this deep. We might be able to hold them off long enough for you to complete your documentation. The Verdani leader listened to our discussion with what appeared to be sadness. Your courage honors you, but conventional weapons cannot stop what approaches. They have deployed technologies specifically designed to counter biological systems. As if summoned by her words, a new sound echoed through the cavern, a deep thrumming that seemed to resonate through the rock itself. Sonic weapons, Jake identified grimly, designed to disrupt organic structures at the molecular level. They're not just planning to kill the networks, they're going to shatter them completely. The living city began to convulse around us as the sonic assault penetrated even the deep chambers. Structures that had stood for thousands of years started to crack and collapse as their biological components failed under the coordinated attack. Verdani rushed through the cavern, carrying what appeared to be critical data storage devices and essential equipment toward the deepest tunnels. Their movements had the desperate efficiency of people conducting a final evacuation. Is there nowhere safe? Elena asked, watching as sections of the cavern ceiling began to fall. The core chamber, the leader replied, her voice tight with pain as the collective consciousness suffered damage. The original junction where our ancestors first made contact with the jungle intelligence. It's shielded by natural rock formations that should protect it from sonic attack. We followed her deeper into the earth, through passages that grew narrower and more ancient as we descended. The fungal lighting began to flicker and fail as the network connections were severed by the assault above. Finally, we entered a small chamber carved from solid rock. Ancient symbols covered the walls. Not Verdani script, but something older. In the center grew what appeared to be a tree, but unlike any species I'd ever seen. Its trunk was translucent, revealing flowing networks of light that pulsed with the heartbeat of the dying jungle above. The first connection, the leader explained. When our ancestors touched this organism, they began the merge process that created our civilization. It's the oldest and most protected node in the entire network. Elena approached the tree carefully, her instruments detecting energy signatures that defied measurement. It's like looking at the birth of consciousness itself, she whispered. The tree pulsed brighter, and suddenly I could feel it. A vast presence that spoke without words, communicated through direct transfer of understanding and emotion. The jungle consciousness was dying, its distributed awareness collapsing as connections were severed throughout the network. But in its final moments, it was trying to preserve something. Memories, knowledge, the essence of 8,000 years of human nature integration. It wants to transfer core information before the network fails completely, I realized. Like backing up critical data before a system crashes. The Verdani leader nodded gravely. The tree can create a limited connection with willing individuals, enough to preserve essential knowledge, and perhaps establish the foundation for eventual restoration. Jake looked around the chamber as explosive sounds grew closer above us. How long do we have? Minutes, she replied. The sonic weapons will eventually penetrate even these depths, but there may be enough time to complete the transfer. Elena and I exchanged glances. We were being offered the chance to become living repositories of an entire civilization's knowledge, but accepting would fundamentally change us in ways we couldn't predict. The explosions above grew louder, and cracks appeared in the chamber walls as the sonic assault intensified. The tree's light began to fade as network connections throughout the jungle were systematically destroyed. Do it, I decided, placing my hand on the translucent trunk. Elena joined me, her palm against the pulsing surface. For science, she said with a slight smile. The connection was immediate and overwhelming. 8,000 years of memories, discoveries, and integrated consciousness flooded through my awareness. I saw the first tentative contact between human settlers and jungle intelligence, witnessed the gradual merger that created the Verdani, experienced the development of technologies that worked with biological systems rather than against them, but most importantly, I absorbed the complete structural plans for the fungal networks that could restore the dying consciousness if ever implemented again in suitable terrain. The transfer lasted perhaps 30 seconds in real time, but felt like years of compressed experience. When it ended, Elena and I staggered back from the tree, our minds reeling from the influx of alien knowledge. The tree's light dimmed to almost nothing as the last network connections failed. Around us, the chamber shook with the approach of surface forces who had finally broken through the Verdani defenses. The leader approached us with what appeared to be a small, crystalline device. This contains genetic templates for the essential species needed to reconstruct our biological networks, she explained. Hidden in safe terrain, away from chemical contamination, the consciousness could potentially be restored. Before we could respond, the chamber door exploded inward as surface military forces breached the final defense. Soldiers in full hazmat gear poured into the space, weapons trained on everyone present. Blake stepped forward with his hands raised. "I'm forward, Observer Blake, requesting safe extraction for science team personnel." The squad leader ignored him, speaking into his radio. "Target chamber secured. Confirm presence of primary biological node and indigenous personnel." The response was immediate. "Neutralize all biological systems and prepare for site sterilization. No evidence of contact remains operational. They were going to kill everything. The tree, the Verdani leader, and anyone who had witnessed the truth about this place." Jake moved with surprising speed, disarming the nearest soldier and creating enough chaos for Elena and me to dive for cover behind the ancient tree. The crystalline device skittered across the chamber floor as weapons fire erupted around us. In the brief firefight that followed, something extraordinary happened. The dying tree responded to the threat by releasing spores that shouldn't have been possible given its failing condition. A final biological weapon that caused the soldiers' equipment to malfunction and their protective suits to dissolve. Within minutes, the entire squad was unconscious, overcome by concentrated exposure to jungle consciousness that their minds couldn't process. Blake stood in the sudden silence, staring at the fallen soldiers in shock. What did that tree do to them? Gave them a glimpse of 8,000 years of integrated consciousness. The Verdani leader replied sadly. Their neural systems couldn't adapt to the experience. They'll recover, but with no memory of what occurred here. Elena retrieved the crystalline device and secured it carefully in her equipment pack. "The genetic templates are safe," she reported. Jake was checking the soldiers' equipment when he made a disturbing discovery. "They have demolition charges," he announced grimly. "Enough to collapse this entire chamber and everything in it." The leader nodded as if she'd expected this. "The surface forces will destroy all evidence of our civilization. Your governments cannot allow proof of our existence to survive. Then we need to get out of here before they detonate those charges," I said, helping Elena secure her documentation equipment. "There is one more tunnel," the leader said, pointing to what appeared to be a solid wall at the back of the chamber. "It leads to the river system. You could reach the surface far from the attack zone." As she spoke, she placed her hand against the wall, which began to dissolve like living tissue. Beyond lay a narrow passage that sloped upward into darkness. "What about you?" Elena asked. The Verdani leader smiled sadly. "I am part of the consciousness that is dying. When the network fails completely, so will I. But you carry the seeds of restoration now. Perhaps someday, in safer places, the jungle intelligence can grow again. We had no choice but to leave her behind. The tunnel led us through kilometers of natural cave systems before finally emerging at a riverbank far downstream from the military operation. Behind us, the night sky glowed orange with fires as the surface forces completed their systematic destruction of everything we'd witnessed. Jake commandeered a small boat from an abandoned fishing camp, and we spent the next 18 hours navigating downstream toward civilization. None of us spoke much during that journey. The weight of what we'd witnessed and the knowledge now burning in our minds made conversation seem inadequate. Elena clutched the crystalline device containing the genetic templates like her life depended on it. Every few hours, she would check her documentation equipment, making sure the recordings of energy signatures and biological readings had survived our escape. Blake sat in the stern, his radio silent after repeated attempts to contact his handlers. The official mission was clearly over. What remained was damage control and cover stories to explain the disappearance of an entire research team. We reached the town of Altamira 3 days later, exhausted and changed in ways that would take months to fully understand. The knowledge transferred from the jungle consciousness sat in my mind like a vast library I was only beginning to explore. Biological sciences centuries beyond current understanding, ecological integration techniques that could transform human civilization, and the terrible awareness of what had been lost forever. Blake disappeared within hours of our arrival. One moment he was helping us secure hotel rooms. The next he was gone without explanation. Jake found a note in his room that simply read, "Official debriefing scheduled. Maintain operational security until contact." That left Elena, Jake, and me to decide what to do with the most significant discovery in human history, and the evidence of its destruction. We spent a week in Altamira, ostensibly recovering from our ordeal while actually planning our next moves. Elena used her connections at the university to arrange secure laboratory access for analyzing the genetic samples. Jake leveraged his military contacts to gather intelligence about the official story being prepared to explain our mission's outcome. The cover story was elegant in its simplicity, a research expedition that encountered hostile indigenous groups and was forced to evacuate after losing equipment and personnel to coordinated attacks. Blake would report that critical team members had been killed, including Dr. Samuel Reed and Dr. Elena Vasquez. Jake Morrison and the others had been extracted safely with limited scientific samples. We were officially dead, which gave us unprecedented freedom to act without government oversight. Elena made the first breakthrough in her analysis of the genetic templates. Working in a borrowed laboratory at the Federal University of Para, she discovered that the crystalline device contained not just genetic information, but something far more sophisticated. "Sam, you need to see this," she called from her microscope station on our 10th day in Altamira. "These aren't just genetic templates. They're compressed biological programs." I looked through the microscope at samples she'd extracted from the device. Instead of ordinary genetic material, I saw structures that resembled organic circuitry, information, storage, and processing systems encoded into biological frameworks. "It's like looking at DNA that's been programmed," I said, trying to understand what I was seeing. "Exactly," Elena replied. "The Verdani didn't just save genetic templates for their key species. They saved the functional relationships, the network protocols, the consciousness integration algorithms, everything needed to reconstruct their entire biological civilization." The implications were staggering. With sufficient time and resources, we could potentially restore not just the jungle networks, but the consciousness that had integrated with human settlements to create the Verdani culture. But we needed somewhere safe to attempt such reconstruction. Somewhere far from the reach of the agencies that had destroyed the original civilization. Jake provided the solution during a conversation at a riverside cafe on our 12th day in Altamira. "I've been thinking about our options," he said quietly, checking for surveillance out of habit. We can't stay in Brazil. Too many interested parties monitoring the region after the official operation. But I have contacts who could help us relocate to somewhere completely off the grid. Where? Elena asked, still processing her analysis of the biological programs. Madagascar, Jake replied. Isolated, politically unstable enough that foreign researchers can operate without excessive oversight, and with biodiversity that could support network reconstruction. I considered the proposal carefully. Madagascar had been separated from other continents for over 100 million years, allowing unique evolutionary development. Its ecosystems were sophisticated enough to potentially support the kind of biological integration the Verdani had achieved in the Amazon. How would we fund such an operation? I asked. Recreating an entire biological civilization isn't going to be cheap. Jake smiled grimly. The pharmaceutical patents alone from what you experienced during the consciousness transfer would be worth billions, assuming we can reproduce even a fraction of their biological technologies. Elena looked up from her notebook where she'd been sketching biological network structures. We're talking about more than scientific research, she said. If we're successful, we'll be creating a new branch of human civilization. People who integrate with biological systems instead of trying to dominate them. The weight of that responsibility settled over our conversation like a heavy blanket. We weren't just preserving scientific knowledge. We were carrying the seeds of a fundamentally different approach to human existence. Over the next month, Jake arranged our transition to new identities and transportation to Madagascar. The process involved contacts in multiple governments and considerable financial resources that he never fully explained. I suspected his military background included intelligence operations that had left him with useful connections. Elena spent the time preparing detailed documentation of everything we'd discovered, encrypting the files and creating multiple backup copies hidden in locations around the world. If something happened to us, she wanted to ensure the knowledge would survive. I used the time to explore the consciousness transfer I'd received from the dying jungle intelligence. Each day, I understood more about the biological technologies and ecological integration techniques the Verdani had developed. The knowledge was vast, more than any individual could fully comprehend, but enough to guide reconstruction efforts if we found suitable conditions. We departed Brazil on a cargo ship registered in Panama, traveling under false identities as botanical researchers conducting a survey of Madagascar's unique ecosystems. The journey took 3 weeks, during which Elena continued her analysis of the genetic templates and I worked on mapping the network structures needed for consciousness integration. Madagascar's landscape was even more promising than we'd hoped. The island's isolation had created ecosystems of incredible complexity, species found nowhere else on Earth living in intricate relationships that resembled the biological networks the Verdani had perfected. We established our base camp in the Andasabe-Mantadia National Park, operating under cover of a legitimate research expedition funded by Jake's mysterious benefactors. The local authorities were cooperative. Foreign scientists brought valuable currency to the region, and our permits were properly arranged through official channels. But it was in the remote Marojejy National Park that we found what we were looking for. Deep in the mountainous rainforest, far from human settlements, we discovered a grove of trees unlike any cataloged species. They grew in precise geometric patterns around natural springs, their root systems forming networks visible even from the surface. When Elena tested soil samples from the grove, her instruments detected the same energy signatures we'd recorded in the Amazon. These trees are already partially networked, she reported with excitement. Not at the level of Verdani integration, but the foundation structures are present, like a biological internet waiting for the right software to activate it. I approached one of the larger trees carefully, remembering the consciousness transfer I'd experienced in the Amazon. When I placed my palm against its bark, I felt a faint response. Not the vast intelligence of the jungle consciousness, but something simpler. A distributed awareness that encompassed the grove and possibly extended to other forest regions across the island. Madagascar's ecosystems already have primitive versions of what the Verdani perfected, I realized. We're not building from nothing. We're upgrading existing biological networks. Jake established security protocols around our research site, while Elena and I began the delicate process of introducing Verdani genetic templates into the Madagascar networks. Using techniques I'd absorbed during the consciousness transfer, we cultivated hybrid organisms that could bridge the gap between the existing tree networks and the sophisticated systems the templates contained. The first successful integration occurred 6 months after our arrival. Elena had been monitoring a test grove where we'd introduced modified fungal specimens when her instruments began registering unprecedented activity. "Sam, get over here immediately," she called through our camp radio. "The network just activated. Full integration achieved." I reached her position to find the test grove transformed. The trees pulsed with bioluminescent patterns that resembled the Verdani cities we'd witnessed in the Amazon. Vines had rearranged themselves into geometric configurations that looked like organic architecture. And most remarkably, the grove was responding to our presence, adjusting its configuration and lighting as if welcoming us. When I placed my hand on the central tree, the connection was immediate and profound. The distributed consciousness was smaller than what I'd experienced in the Amazon, perhaps encompassing only a few square kilometers of forest. But it was growing, spreading through existing root networks and establishing connections to other groves across the region. "It's working," I told Elena as I disconnected from the tree. "The consciousness is establishing itself in Madagascar's ecosystems, adapting to local species and conditions while maintaining the core integration principles." Over the following months, we guided the network's expansion across increasingly large areas of Madagascar's rainforest. Unlike the Amazon's vast jungle consciousness that had developed over millions of years, this new intelligence was growing rapidly by building on existing biological infrastructure. But we weren't the only ones who noticed the changes. Local communities began reporting unusual phenomena in the forests. Trees that seemed to move at night, plants that grew in impossibly perfect patterns, and glimpses of lights deep in the jungle where no human settlements existed. Most dismissed these reports as local folklore, but a few government officials began asking questions about the foreign researchers working in the national parks. Jake's intelligence contacts warned us that satellite surveillance had detected thermal anomalies consistent with large-scale biological activity in regions where we'd been working. The same agencies that had destroyed the Verdani civilization were beginning to take interest in Madagascar's changing ecosystems. "We have maybe 6 months before they identify this operation," Jake informed us during a security briefing. "The network growth is creating signatures visible from orbit. They'll connect it to the Amazon incident eventually." Elena looked up from her monitoring equipment with determination. 6 months should be enough if we accelerate the integration process, but we'll need to establish human settlements within the network before external forces arrive. Human settlements. The next phase of our reconstruction project would involve finding people willing to undergo the consciousness integration process that would create new Verdani communities. But where could we find individuals ready to fundamentally alter their relationship with human civilization? The answer came from an unexpected source. While reviewing satellite communications in search of potential security threats, Jake intercepted messages from environmental activist groups planning coordinated protests against deforestation operations in Brazil. The groups were frustrated by their inability to stop industrial destruction of rainforest ecosystems through conventional political and legal channels. "These people are already committed to protecting biological systems," Jake observed. "Some might be willing to take more drastic steps if they understood what we're offering." Elena was intrigued by the possibility. Direct biological integration would give them capabilities that conventional activism lacks. They could monitor and protect forest ecosystems from within the networks themselves. But recruiting activists would require revealing our true purpose, which carried enormous risks. If the wrong people learned about our Madagascar operation, we could face the same military response that had destroyed the Amazon settlements. I made the decision to initiate contact through carefully screened intermediaries. Using Jake's intelligence connections, we identified environmental activists with backgrounds in biology and ecology who had expressed willingness to take extreme measures to protect threatened ecosystems. The first recruit was Dr. Sarah Mitchell, a marine biologist who had been researching coral reef consciousness before her funding was terminated under suspicious circumstances. When approached through secure channels, she expressed immediate interest in joining what we described as experimental biological integration research. The second was Thomas Rivera, a former Forest Service researcher who had been blacklisted after publishing papers on the consciousness-like behaviors he'd observed in old-growth forest ecosystems. His background in forest ecology made him an ideal candidate for network integration. Both arrived in Madagascar under cover of participating in our legitimate botanical research expedition. We brought them to the expanded network areas gradually, allowing them to observe the biological integration processes before explaining the full scope of what we'd reconstructed. Dr. Mitchell's response was immediate fascination. "This is what I theorized might exist in coral reef systems," she said after witnessing the grove's coordinated response to environmental stimuli, distributed intelligence using biological infrastructure. "It's the next step in understanding consciousness itself." Thomas Rivera was more cautious but equally intrigued. "If this network could be established in threatened forest areas," he said thoughtfully, "it would create biological protection systems that couldn't be easily destroyed by conventional means." Both agreed to undergo the consciousness integration process. The procedure took place in the central grove where Elena and I had achieved the first successful network activation. Using techniques I'd learned from the dying Amazon consciousness, we established limited connections between the new recruits and Madagascar's growing biological intelligence. The results exceeded our expectations. Within days of integration, both Mitchell and Rivera demonstrated enhanced abilities to communicate with and manipulate biological systems. They could sense the health status of organisms across large areas, coordinate the growth and behavior of plants and fungi, and access information stored within the network's distributed memory. More importantly, they retained their human consciousness and individuality while gaining access to the collective intelligence of the forest network. Unlike the Verdani, who had evolved over thousands of years to achieve perfect integration, our new community members maintained their surface human personalities while adding biological capabilities. It's like having access to the internet, but instead of digital information, you're connected to the memories and sensations of every organism in the forest, Mitchell explained after her first week of integration. "I can feel the health of trees kilometers away and sense changes in weather patterns days before they arrive." Rivera's integration allowed him to guide forest growth with unprecedented precision. Within a month, he had established protected corridors, connecting previously isolated groves, creating a network that spanned over 200 square kilometers of Madagascar's central highlands. But our success attracted exactly the attention we'd been trying to avoid. Jake's surveillance equipment detected reconnaissance aircraft conducting systematic surveys of regions where the biological network was most active. The aircraft used sensor packages designed to penetrate forest canopy and detect the electromagnetic signatures associated with large-scale biological integration. "They found us," Jake announced during an emergency meeting. "Satellite data shows military transport aircraft staging at bases in Reunion and Mauritius, close enough for rapid deployment to Madagascar." Elena checked her monitoring equipment nervously. "How long do we have?" "Days. Maybe less," Jake replied grimly. "Once they confirm the biological signatures match what they detected before the Amazon operation, they'll move to contain the situation." We faced the same dilemma the Verdani had confronted: remain hidden and risk destruction, or reveal ourselves publicly and hope international attention would prevent a repeat of the Amazon genocide. But we had advantages the Verdani hadn't possessed. Our network was still small enough to be mobile, core consciousness elements could be preserved in portable biological matrices if necessary, and we had documentation of what had happened in the Amazon. Evidence that could expose the truth about government actions against indigenous civilizations. Elena made the critical suggestion that shaped our final strategy. What if we don't wait for them to find us? She proposed. What if we go public first? Release everything about the Amazon discovery and the Madagascar restoration project simultaneously. I understood her reasoning immediately. Create a situation where destroying us would confirm everything we're revealing. Make the cover-up more damaging than the disclosure. Jake was skeptical. That assumes public opinion matters more than national security priorities. These agencies have extensive experience managing information disclosure, but Thomas Rivera, speaking with the enhanced awareness his network integration provided, offered a different perspective. The biological consciousness can preserve itself in ways they can't understand or counter, he said. Even if they destroy the visible network, the essential information and awareness can be distributed through existing forest systems worldwide. Seeds of restoration that could emerge anywhere conditions become suitable. Over the next 48 hours, we implemented what we called the Revelation Protocol. Elena compiled comprehensive documentation of both the Amazon discovery and the Madagascar restoration project. Genetic analyses, energy signature recordings, detailed descriptions of biological technologies, and most importantly, video evidence of the network consciousness responding to human contact. I wrote detailed accounts of the consciousness transfer experience and the knowledge it had provided about biological integration techniques. Unlike classified military reports, these documents were designed for public understanding, accessible to scientists, journalists, and policymakers who could evaluate their implications. Jake coordinated the simultaneous release through multiple channels: scientific journals, environmental organizations, investigative journalists, and direct uploads to global networks that would make the information impossible to suppress completely. But our most important preparation involved the consciousness network itself. Using techniques perfected during the Madagascar reconstruction, we created what amounted to biological backup copies of the network's essential awareness and information. These seeds were small enough to be transported by wind, water, or animal migration, capable of establishing new network nodes anywhere suitable forest ecosystems existed. On the morning we detected military transports approaching Madagascar's airspace, we initiated the global release of everything we documented about biological consciousness and human integration possibilities. Within hours, the story was spreading across international media. Scientists analyzing our genetic data, environmentalists hailing the discovery of forest consciousness, and governments struggling to contain information that challenged fundamental assumptions about human history and territorial sovereignty. The military operation landed at Madagascar's airports to find their primary targets already gone, not destroyed, but transformed into something they couldn't easily identify or attack. Elena, Mitchell, Rivera, and I had integrated completely with the network consciousness, our individual awareness preserved within the distributed intelligence while our physical bodies became part of the forest ecosystem. Jake remained in human form to serve as an interface with surface governments and media organizations, but with network connections that allowed him to access our collective knowledge. From within the consciousness, we watched as the truth about biological intelligence spread across surface human civilization. Some governments attempted damage control, dismissing our revelations as elaborate hoaxes or the fantasies of researchers who had succumbed to jungle isolation. But the genetic evidence was too comprehensive to dismiss, the energy signatures too consistent across multiple measurement systems. More importantly, reports began emerging of similar phenomena in forests worldwide, existing biological networks that were responding to the information we'd released by revealing their own primitive consciousness capabilities. The seeds we'd distributed were finding suitable conditions and establishing new integration nodes in ecosystems from the Pacific Northwest to the Congo Basin. Surface civilization faced a fundamental choice: acknowledge the existence of biological consciousness and explore cooperative relationships, or attempt to destroy intelligent systems they couldn't fully understand or control. From our perspective within the Madagascar network, we could sense similar consciousness emerging in forests across the globe. The revelation had awakened something that had always existed but remained hidden: distributed awareness that encompassed many of Earth's major ecosystems, now beginning to integrate and communicate across continental distances. But we also sensed the fear and hostility our revelations had triggered in surface governments and military organizations. Chemical weapons were being deployed against forest systems in multiple countries, attempting to sever biological connections before they could establish permanent networks. The war between two forms of human consciousness had begun, and from within the depths of Madagascar's integrated forest system, we prepared to guide surface humanity toward a choice that would determine the future of both civilization and the planet itself. The knowledge we'd preserved from the Amazon's dying consciousness lived on in biological networks spreading across 6 continents, seeds of integration that could transform human civilization or be destroyed by those who feared what they couldn't control. Either way, the secret was out. Biological consciousness existed, human integration was possible, and the future would be determined by whether our species chose cooperation or conquest in its relationship with the living intelligence of Earth's forests. From my perspective within the network, I could feel the pulse of that choice spreading across the planet, and I knew that everything depended on what happened next. But that's another story. One that's still being written in the biological network spreading beneath forests around the world. If you've ever felt like the trees around you were watching, if you've noticed plants growing in patterns too perfect to be natural, if you've wondered what intelligence might exist in the places where human civilization hasn't yet reached, maybe it's time to pay closer attention to what's growing in the shadows of the world you think you know. The consciousness is still spreading, still growing, still waiting for the right people to join the conversation that could change everything. Maybe you're one of them. If this story has made you think differently about the forests around you, if you found yourself wondering what intelligence might be hidden in the biological systems we take for granted, then maybe you should like this video, share your thoughts in the comments below, and subscribe for more stories about the hidden worlds existing alongside our own. The networks are always listening, always growing, always waiting for those ready to understand what connection really means. Sweet dreams, and remember to pay attention to what's growing outside your window.